So welcome everybody. Thank you very much. I know that we have a number of people that are still logging in, but I'm going to get started because we've got a pretty full webinar ahead of us. So as we're going through, I welcome everyone to tell us a little bit about why wetlands are important to you. What made you decide to sign up for this webinar? We had a total of 98 people registered, so it's a big topic out there that a lot of people are very interested in. So I'm going to start off. We are recording this session and we are going to be having this available for viewing in about a week, and I'll give you the name of the link where the webinar will be at partway through my couple of slides here. So thank you everybody for joining. This is an RDKB hosted watershed webinar session, a science and learning event for the Boundary region. We're looking to host one of these about every couple of months, and it's just to really help us understand so much of what's out there, share knowledge, both from the presenters and as well as the attendees through questions and sharing of that engagement. And as I mentioned, this webinar is recorded and it's going to be posted on the RDKB site, and I'll give you a link for that in just a second. So as we begin, I acknowledge the First Nations and Indigenous influence on the Boundary region and the First Nation traditional history here in the Boundary watersheds. I respectfully appreciate that the land on which many of us gather on and referenced in this webinar is a converging traditional and unceded territory of the Syilx, Sinixt, and Secwepemc peoples, as well as the Métis people who have also touched these lands. We're grateful to have this collective opportunity to share our knowledge and information via this webinar, as so many of us are in these virtual events now, both from our presenters and our attendees. Wetlands are such an important component of our ecosystems. So many of us have different experiences and knowledge about wetlands. It could be the influence of the biodiversity, how to encourage that resiliency. Maybe it's protecting a natural asset, and certainly we're going to be hearing a little bit about stormwater. Identifying, protecting, and restoring wetlands has become more and more important. At least that's the impression I have, but I suspect, Tom, over the years that you've been working in it, you may speak slightly differently. So I see this as an opportunity for all of us to learn together from each other. Yourselves, the attendees here, as asking questions, putting information in that chat box, telling us why are these important, asking the questions, and then sharing of that knowledge. And Tom, of course, our presenter, as we all share stories and provide comments about these environments. So for those of you who have attended some of these RDKB webinars in the past, you are going to recognize a couple of the polls. So one of the interesting parts of this webinar is focused for the Boundary region. These RDKB watershed webinars are. So it's always interesting for us to be able to find out where are our attendees calling in from. So right now we've got 56 people that have just signed in. And so it's nice to be able to find out where people are coming from, how many are in the boundary, how many are the outside of it. And the other one that's really interesting is, even though you may not live in the boundary, do you work in the boundary? Is it part of your region? I know that we've got a number of BC government people that have registered for this. So you might be in that Kootenay boundary region. So understanding some of that as well. So I'll just give that a few more seconds here. And for those of you that aren't from the boundary, we hope once we're able to travel again that you'll come and check out this pretty amazing spot. It's been pretty new for me, and I've been really enjoying it. So the picture we've got here on that front page is Christina Lake, the back end of Christina Lake, which is stunning, and some great trails to get to it. So I'll just check out the poll here. Oh gosh, 82% of people have responded. So there we are. So we've got majority of the people, 69% of people outside of the boundary, but for those in the boundary, it's pretty evenly over our electoral areas. A couple more in Area D, Area C, and Area E, and it's 23%. So that would be certainly of that 31% that were in the boundary, work in the boundary, even though they don't live here. So there's certainly a lot of information that we all have to be able to share with us. So that's pretty neat. So really quickly, I'm Christina Anderson, a watershed planner for the Regional District of Kootenay Boundary. I've been here a year and a half, almost 2 years. And yeah, spending a lot of time getting to know these areas. Pretty excited to be able to work, live, and play in the Boundary region. And so our goal for these webinars is just to be exploring these watersheds. And I'm really excited to have Tom here with us. So as we have Tom on the video right beside, or I don't know, below me, in the video area of mine, Tom Biebighauser is a wetland ecologist and wildlife biologist working in the field for over 40 years, specializing in planning and building of wetlands and streams that have provided habitat for endangered, threatened species and animals. Sorry, threatened species of animals and plants. Working in many environments, which I thought was pretty interesting, Tom. Urban agriculture, you worked with a lot of school groups, it looks like, working on mines, mine lands, and forest regions. So I'm keen to hear what keeps Tom going? What's the passion regarding this work? That yeah, it'll be interesting to hear it through the presentation. So I first heard about Tom. I first heard Tom's name 10 years ago. I was looking over a proposed wetland restoration project, and someone said to me, "Oh, you really got to study that one. That is Tom Biebighauser's work." And from then on, I just kept hearing his name. Working along with the BC Wildlife Federation, working on wetland restoration through southern BC, and of course, now that I'm looking into it. Yeah, you've done a lot of work outside of certainly my areas of knowledge. Alberta, Ontario, countries such as New Zealand, Puerto Rico, Taiwan, and the States, which is where Tom is from. And the last I heard on Tom's location, he's currently working in Rhode Island, or at least you were last week. I'm sort of looking over at Tom to see if I get a nod that I'm still there or not. Working on building a wetland for eastern spadefoot, an endangered species for that region. So thank you very much, Tom, for joining us. I realize the importance of wetland health and restoration for a while now, but it seems to be something that I'm just hearing more and more in the watershed management discussions, and both tied to the supporting resilient ecosystems, providing benefits associated with the natural asset components of the stormwater. So yeah, I'm really excited to have Tom here to show us the wetland basics and to look at what we need, what do we need to know, or what is good for us to be able to understand, and how can we better protect and restore these environments. So just for info for a group here, we've got 61 people registered at the moment, or sorry, signed in. So I'm going to do the second poll. This is a really nice one for everybody, just to be able to understand what's your knowledge of the wetlands? There are a number of different types of wetlands, and are you good at least saying, yeah, that's a wetland, or can you go, hey, I know that that's a fen, or that's a bog. So yeah, I didn't specify it in the poll, but it's yeah, it's pretty neat. So both for the group here to understand what we have in terms of the experience for people, and for Tom to be able to understand as he's doing this presentation. This is sort of what we're looking at. So let's give it a little bit more time. We've certainly got a number of people still filling out this poll. And just give me just a bit more. It's one of those things when you've got 61 people signed in, it takes a little bit of time to go through it. There we go. Okay. So neat. So there you go, Tom. So the more common one is, people are good at those really obvious ones that, yeah, this looks like a wetland, but definitely not too good at some of the specifics. So that's and I'm super grateful for the people that are saying, no, I'm not very good at identifying wetland at all. So this is, thank you very much, everybody, for joining in. This has been pretty interesting. And yeah, sorry, I'm just looking at have you participated in our wetland restoration project? So just definitely the majority of people are no, and I think there's probably a lot of interest in there here. Okay, so one of the last things I wanted to quickly say is that I've got a survey at the very end of the presentation. You're going to get the survey right as you shut down your webinar, as well as you'll be sent it in an email tomorrow. It's the same survey, so only you need to fill it out once. But it just sort of helps us, especially during these, like I said, these virtual times, to be able to better understand what's working and what are, yeah. So, and where can we do some changes? Really quickly, I'm pretty sure everybody here has participated in Zoom. Chat box, we're going to be using it for technical issues or general comments and just sort of some of that feedback. Raise your hand. We've got a lot of people registered at the moment or signed in, so we're probably not going to be opening it up to speech, but in the event that you're having a problem trying to engage, feel free to raise your hand and we certainly can work at speaking to you. Also, you're welcome to contact myself, Christine Anderson, separately through the chat box. You just be able to do that. And the Q&A. So with questions and answers, I'm asking all questions to be able to use that Q&A box. It's a really nice way for us to be able to keep all the questions together. And so what we'll do is we'll approach the questions, we'll go through them at the end of the presentation with Tom. If there's any questions that are going to really help with the understanding of the presentation, then I certainly will. I'll interrupt Tom there and get that clarification in there. But and if there's something I can quickly answer, I'll try to, but we'll probably leave those to the very end. So on that note, I will stop sharing and I will pass this over to you, Tom.
Very good. Thank you. Appreciate the invitation to talk about wetlands, my favorite topic. Let me see if I can get things going here.
Great. So are you still in Rhode Island?
Oh, no, back in Kentucky.
Oh, wow.
I leave for California this weekend. We're going to be building 18 wetlands for the endangered California red-legged frog. Looking forward to it.
Wow, I look forward to seeing the photos.
Okay, I think we're ready.
So I was just going to quickly say that Tom is going to shut off his video for the presentation, just to be able to help with the internet, and then we'll come back on again.
Very good. All right, wetlands, I consider them the most amazing ecosystem you're going to see, especially in British Columbia, which is beautiful with all the mountains and the valleys, the green valleys. In this presentation, we're going to visit wetlands across BC, and we're going to learn why communities are working so hard to protect and to restore these wetlands. Okay, let's see. All right, I'm trying to get it to advance. There we go, it worked. Okay. Now, wetlands generally contain shallow water. It makes sense, but they may not contain shallow water for all or part of the year. And there are many different types of wetlands out there. The one that you're looking at on the screen here is what we call a shallow marsh. And this is the wetland that most people will identify. We know it's a shallow marsh because it has cattails growing around the edge, lily pads floating on the water. And the shallow marsh is the type of wetland that makes the calendars and makes the photos. When we're trying to convince folks that wetlands are of great value and have all this beauty, we like to show them what a shallow marsh looks like. Now, this is also a shallow marsh, and this is found on the Salix and Sedge Farm near Selmo, BC. Now, shallow marsh wetlands contain this incredible diversity of plants and animals. The list is very long of plants and animals that you're going to find in a shallow marsh. Now, this photo shows a different type of wetland that we call a fen. Now, aquatic plants that we call sedges, they grow most commonly in fens. And there's a saying that we have about sedges. Sedges have edges, rushes are round, grasses have nodes that go to the ground. Well, sedges are full of these fens, and sedges provide important forage to elk in the fall and in the winter. They provide nesting habitat for sandhill cranes, and they're rearing areas for frogs and toads. These are the nursery areas for the frogs and toads. Now, the soils in fens are like other wetlands, they're saturated. So if you were to go into a fen and dig a hole with a shovel, more than likely that hole will fill with water. And this is true for most wetlands. If you want to know if you're in a wetland, dig a hole, and more than likely water will come into that hole. Also, how do you know you're in a wetland? Maybe somebody's tried to drive across it. And if they try to drive across it, they're going to get stuck. They're going to leave deep ruts. Those ruts are going to fill with water. And also, if you visit a wetland and you dig a hole, the smell is probably not going to be the best because there's hydrogen sulfide that's in the soil. And you're going to smell that, and it's going to kind of smell like baby diapers. Now, here's another wetland, and this is what we call a wet meadow wetland. And this also has a diversity of plants, but it includes many of the wildflowers, the bulrushes, along with some sedges. Wet meadows support high populations of small mammals. And when you think about the food chain and the importance of small mammals to the food chain, this is where many of our small mammals will live. And the small mammals that live in these wet meadows provide food for hawks, for owls, fox, and bobcat. Now, this is a shrub fen wetland. Interesting, isn't it? Also has the sedges, but it has the shrubs. And you're going to find willow in this wetland, more likely alder. And also, there's going to be some short trees. Maybe there'll be some birch growing in the wetland. Now, these are the wetlands that are used by moose for food. So parts of BC where you want to see moose, if you find the shrub fen wetlands, more than likely in the winter, you're going to see moose using these for food. You'll recognize this wetland as a swamp. And we find trees, we find shrubs growing in swamps. We see a lot of wood laying on the ground. Swamps are challenging to walk through because you're going up over mounds, you're going down into pits, and you're always going around this wood that's scattered on the surface. You'll find a great diversity of mosses and ferns growing in swamp wetlands. These are beautiful places to visit. Here's a swamp, and you see the skunk cabbage growing in it. And this is typical in swamp wetlands where you see the skunk cabbage, and the ground's going to be saturated, and you can see some shallow water growing around the skunk cabbage. Now, here's a water feature within a swamp. And if you walk through enough natural swamps, you're going to find these small pools of water. And the salamanders and the frogs are breeding in these pools. Now, this swamp that you're looking at here is on Jim and Janet Mainland's farm, and that's in Meadow Creek. And it's just a special place with all the plants and all the wood on the ground and just all the wildlife that's using this habitat. Now, this wetland doesn't look like much. It's an ephemeral wetland. And ephemeral wetlands tend to be the least appreciated wetlands. And I think it's because they would not be based on culture. These are the ephemeral wetlands. They fill with water in the spring. They dry in the fall. You're going to see shallow water in an ephemeral wetland in the spring during snowmelt. But then as summer progresses and we get into fall, these are going to dry. And these ephemeral wetlands may look like a muddy area come fall season. Now, wetlands occur in complexes. We have different types of wetlands and areas. And here we are looking at a photo of the Creston Valley Wildlife Area. And you'll see a swamp, a shallow marsh, and you'll see a wet meadow. All these wetland types are in this one image. Wetlands are fascinating places to explore. Swamps are not the scary places that one sees in movies, but they're fascinating places where you'll see all these different plants and animals you'll see nowhere else. And when you go to a wetland, you can't help but smile and laugh and really enjoy what you see. And people who help manage our communities, our cities, they're recognizing that people are willing to travel great distances to see wetlands and the abundance of wildlife that use wetland areas. And these are great tourist attractions. And I watch people who visit wetlands and they see things. And when you visit a wetland, more than likely you're going to see frogs and toads. You're going to have chances to photograph. Everybody's phones come out, and there is such a diversity of plants and animals, and they're so readily seen when you go to these habitats. Everyone likes seeing mallards in a wetland. Or who doesn't like seeing ducklings in a wetland this time of year? Wetlands are about the most productive ecosystem on Earth. There is so much for animals to eat in a wetland area. Wood ducks. I mean, if you see a wood duck, you're going to remember it. The most beautiful duck in the world. The female wood duck who's on the left, she's going to lay her eggs in hollow trees near wetland areas. Everyone can recognize the red-winged blackbird, the bright red wing patch on the male. The female is more cryptically colored. She's the one who builds her nests in the cattails of a shallow marsh. And that red patch is so important to the male. I was reading over a master's paper, and they looked at the size of that red patch, and they adjusted it on some male red-winged blackbirds by putting some tape over it. And they found that the smaller the red patch, the less likely that redwing was to attract a mate. If you look closely in the center of this photo, you're going to see a yellow-headed blackbird. They also nest in cattails along the edges of shallow marshes. I'm sure you recognize the great blue heron. The great blue heron will feed on frogs, snakes, crayfish, and fish that are found in wetland areas. Their numbers are decreasing in parts of BC. Just a little bit of a safety warning. A number of years ago, a friend of mine found injured great blue heron in a shallow marsh, and he went to help it out. He picked it up and it speared him right between the eyes. Now, he may have won a Darwin Award for that, but fortunately he was okay, and it didn't cause him too much pain, but plenty of embarrassment. One's likely to see white-tailed deer in wetland areas, especially around the edges of the shallow marshes and in the wet meadow wetlands. And the reason for this is that they're finding food to eat, but the aquatic plants that are in wetlands contain high concentrations of sodium. And these aquatic plants in wetlands will concentrate sodium. And that's really important because we're building wetlands to help clean runoff from highways and parking lots. So the water that's found in these wetlands, it's also of great importance to white-tailed deer and the females when they are nursing in the summer. It's giving them something to drink, plus all that food. Moose, we're going to see these in shallow water wetlands, the shallow marshes, and they depend on the aquatic plants also for the minerals and for other nutrients. The water in the wetlands will also cool the moose during the summer. They get overheated, the insects torment them, and if they can get into that shallow water of a wetland, they are happy and they are content. You're likely to see elk feeding on the aquatic plants within and near the wetlands. And where else are we going to see western painted turtles? They're associated with these shallow marshes, with these wetland areas. Like so many other species in BC, wetlands are the breadbasket for many of these different animal species. Tundra swans are just beautiful. And here they are using a new wetland that we built on Terry Halloran's farm near Meadow Creek. And you're going to remember this site forever if you see the tundra swans. Grizzly bears. We're finding that grizzly bears and their cubs frequent wetlands. And they use the wetlands to feed on the sedges and the rushes and the cattails and the horsetail that are all growing in these saturated soils. And it just makes sense that bears would use wetlands so much. It's the shallow water and the sunlight, and these are like the most productive gardens you're going to find. There's so much for them to eat. The western toad that you see in this photo is a species at risk. It depends on wetlands. This species faces many problems in BC with wetlands being drained and filled, and also it's being run over in high numbers when it attempts to cross roads on a rainy night. We're looking at western toad larvae, or we can call them tadpoles. And these are the tadpoles of the western toad, and they have a chance of surviving if they grow up in an ephemeral wetland that doesn't contain fish and doesn't contain the non-native American bullfrog that eats them. And this is where you see the larva of the western toad in the spring. It's in the very shallow water of these ephemeral wetlands. That water is quite warm. There's plenty of aquatic plants, algae for them to eat. The northern leopard frog, one of the rarest frog species in BC. It's only found now on the Crested Valley Wildlife Area. And if you have a chance to see one, it's something really unique. You're going to find an amazing diversity of wildflowers growing in wetland areas. And we hear a lot about helping pollinators, and folks are doing great things by building gardens in urban areas. And these gardens are generally in upland sites and really help out the pollinators like the monarch. But it's the wet meadows that really produce so many of these aquatic plants that are flowering and of critical importance to the monarch. And it's the ephemeral wetland that's really important to butterflies. That saturated soil, that exposed mud has all these minerals that are used by butterflies. In wetlands, you may find this beautiful steeple bush. Other people call it hardhack or spirea. Flowers for quite a while, important for pollinators. Or in the spring, maybe you'll see skunk cabbage, a wetland plant. The flower is just beautiful. The odor is an acquired taste. You may or may not like it. Water lilies, floating on the surface in the shallow marshes. They flower also a long time and are very important to pollinators. And then we have all these rare species of plants. You're looking at the Oregon checkered mallow, and this is growing in a wet meadow wetland near Rossland, BC. Let's talk a minute about the values of wetlands. See, wetlands have been drained and filled since the late 1800s in BC. But what we're finding out is that wetlands will naturally clean contaminated water. And many communities now are cleaning pollutants by filtering that water, by running it through wetlands. If you take contaminated water, put it into a wetland, it's going to come out a whole lot cleaner. Communities across North America are finding out that wetlands can help control these unsightly algae blooms. And we're developing wetlands to trap the nitrogen and the phosphorus and to greatly reduce the likelihood of algae becoming a problem in adjoining lakes. Here's a wetland that we built near Logan Lake. And we've been building wetlands near Logan Lake, BC for years to clean runoff from an old salt storage shed and from a golf course before it enters Logan Lake, and to provide habitat for wildlife. The BC Wildlife Federation helped to design and build the wetland that you're looking at here. And we built this near Quamachin Lake in Duncan, BC, a series of wetlands to remove sediment from a development located upstream. Wetlands absorb floodwater just like a giant sponge. And this is of critical importance because flooding is a major problem in many communities, and the flooding is getting worse. The people in Grand Forks, BC, they know the disaster we call flooding. And I came across this fact from the US. More than 4 million houses and small apartment buildings across the United States have substantial risk of expensive flood damage, according to the First Street Foundation. This is a nonprofit research foundation. And they found that the cost of flood damage to homes will increase by more than 50% in the US over the next 30 years. If you ever cleaned up after a flood, you know it's a mess, it's hard work, and it's costly. If you ever tried to drive a highway after a flood, you know the significant damage that flooding causes to our roads. All right, this is the symbol for the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. And I came across a study that they commissioned. And what they found, the lowest cost way of controlling flooding in a community is to protect the existing wetlands. If you have wetlands, guess what? They're helping you control your flooding. Protect them. The next lowest cost way to attenuate flooding is to restore wetland areas. The BC Wildlife Federation is working in partnership with the Yakanuki Lower Kootenay Band, the Columbia Basin Trust, and the Fish and Wildlife Compensation Program, and the Aboriginal Fund for Species at Risk to complete the Yakanuki Hunting Grounds Ecosystem Restoration Project near Creston. And this map shows you some of the activities that are underway with this project at this time. Now, this photo shows a project the day it was completed. And this is the Yakanuki Hunting Grounds Ecosystem Project, where we're removing over 2 kilometers of constructed dams and reconnecting over 90 hectares of floodplain with the Kootenay River. And that area labeled as removed dam, that was a substantial dam, and it was one of a number of dams that have already been removed at the hunting grounds. As part of the Hunting Grounds project, we restored 2 riffles to help control erosion as well as to provide important habitat to fish. And these riffles were part of reconnecting a cutoff loop of the Goat River South. This was a 1.2 kilometer long cutoff loop of the Goat River South that had been cut off by the construction of dams. And this 1.2 kilometer loop was reconnected as part of the Hunting Grounds project. Isn't that beautiful? This is one of 4 streams that was restored as part of the Yakanuki Hunting Grounds project. Notice the shape of the stream has a little bit of sinuosity. It's not very deep. The banks are low and it's shallow. And this is how many streams look like in BC before they were changed for farming. Here's one of 60 wetlands that have been restored so far for the Yakanuki Hunting Grounds Ecosystem Restoration Project. And it's interesting, when you look at this wetland here that was restored, it's hard to believe that there was a mound about 3 meters high in the middle of it that had filled it. So we removed over 46 of these large mounds as part of the project. The BC Wildlife Federation is working in partnership with the City of Trail to remove the Cambridge Creek Reservoir Dam, the Violin Lake Dam, and 2 other smaller dams near Trail. These dams were originally built in 1918 to supply water to the City of Trail. The dams are failing, they are no longer needed. And as part of the project, we're planning to restore a diversity of wetlands and streams, as well as to decommission the dams. So what about mosquitoes? When you let people know that you listened to this presentation on wetlands today, one of the naysayers is going to say, hey, what about mosquitoes? Many people wrongly believe that wetlands are the reason that mosquitoes are a problem in their community. Here's what mosquito larvae look like. They're about 1 centimeter long. You're going to find them in very temporary pools of water, and they wiggle. They come to the surface to breathe. They're easy to see. You don't need a microscope. You could just lean over the edge of a water body and determine whether or not these mosquito larvae are present. The red circles in this image show where mosquito larvae may be breeding, or may be found around your home. Now, the red circles show where small puddles may occur that don't hold water long enough for mosquito predators to live in them. So these all could be mosquito breeders. The water in this ditch is a mosquito breeder. The ditch was dug to drain a large wetland, but the ditch contains this shallow water for short time periods, and it gives mosquitoes a great place to breed. See the ruts in this wet meadow wetland? Mosquitoes are likely breeding in these ruts. This is not a healthy wetland with all the ruts in it. Does this look like healthy wetland? Nope. The water trapped in these old tires provides mosquitoes with breeding habitat and not the predators that feed on mosquito larvae. Another unhealthy wetland, the water in this bucket contains mosquito larvae. These are all features that help mosquitoes to breed in your community. How about this? Visit most any ranch in BC, and you're going to find mosquito larvae in their water tanks, unless they change that water frequently. These are not healthy wetlands. They don't contain mosquito predators. So the dragonfly you see here, and ones like it, they prey on adult mosquitoes and can control the adult mosquitoes. This is a dragonfly larva, and the dragonfly larvae prey on mosquito larvae. And the dragonfly larvae depend on wetlands for their survival. And this is where they breed, the dragonfly. And this is a mosquito predator, a ferocious mosquito predator. Damselflies will feed on mosquito adults. And the larvae of damselflies, they will feed on mosquito larvae. Here we're looking at a predaceous diving beetle. Now this is quite a predator found in wetland areas. And adult and the larva predaceous diving beetles, they live in wetland areas, and the larva predaceous diving beetles feed on larva mosquitoes, and the adults can feed on the larva as well. And these will consume many, many mosquitoes in one day. This is a rough-skinned newt, and the rough-skinned newt is fairly common to BC. They live in wetlands. Their larvae feed on mosquito larvae. The adults feed on mosquito larvae. And newts are rather unique. One thing you don't want to do is to put a newt in your mouth. And I came across this on the internet where individuals die every year because they're pledging for a fraternity. And generally it's young males will go out and catch a newt and eat it. And that's a quick way to meet your maker right there. So please, we don't want you eating newts, and they don't want you eating newts. And it's just some things are not meant to be eaten. Okay, this is a northwestern salamander, the most efficient predator of mosquito larvae in wetlands. And I really want you to remember this. Salamander larvae control mosquito larvae in healthy wetlands. The northwestern salamander is found breeding in wetlands across BC, and this is a mosquito larva eater. Isn't it interesting, the gills on the salamander larva? This is a long-toed salamander larva. It is also the most efficient mosquito predator and definitely preys on the mosquito larva. And there's a number of publications out there that clearly show if you have salamanders live in your wetland, then you're not going to have mosquitoes or mosquito larvae. Bats will feed on adult mosquitoes that are flying near the wetlands at night. Tree swallows, a very efficient predator of adult mosquitoes that are flying near wetlands during the day. Okay, so what do we say about a healthy wetland? Mosquitoes may check in, but they won't check out. Mosquitoes don't have a chance of surviving if they fly near or lay their eggs in a healthy wetland. If they do this, there's going to be all sorts of mosquito predators living in and near that wetland that will use them for food. And this is really important to remember about mosquitoes and wetlands. Okay, we're going to talk a little bit about ephemeral wetlands. And these are also called vernal ponds or vernal pools. These are the wetlands that fill this time of year in the spring, and then they dry in the fall. Now, ephemeral wetlands are uncommon in BC. Hey, they're uncommon in Alberta. They're uncommon in the States. Many people don't think they have much value because they don't hold water all year. I've had so many people say this to me over the years. Well, that wetland dries. It doesn't contain fish. It doesn't have any value. Well, guess what? They do. An ephemeral wetland, because it dries, will not support non-native fish. You're looking at a sunfish here, which is non-native to BC. They can't survive in ephemeral wetland because they go dry. This is an American bullfrog. Ephemeral wetlands are not used by the American bullfrog for breeding. This is a non-native species that has entered BC. Their tadpoles require 2 years to develop in a wetland. Now, the adult bullfrog is a fierce predator. It will control the native amphibians in wetlands in BC. It will control the northern leopard frog, the Pacific tree frog, the northern red-legged frog, all these species. An American bullfrog will eat about anything it gets in a mouth. It can eat small muskrats, it can eat turtles, it can eat fish, anything. So ephemeral wetlands are good because the bullfrog can't capitalize on them for breeding. So what do we find in ephemeral wetlands? Pacific tree frogs, like the one shown here. They're of critical importance, these ephemeral wetlands, to native amphibians because they don't support non-native fish and they don't support the non-native American bullfrog. You're likely to find Columbia spotted frogs that are breeding in ephemeral wetlands. You're likely to find western toads breeding in ephemeral wetlands. And what's interesting about the western toad, the larva, they can actually sense if the ephemeral wetland is drying faster than they want it to, and they can accelerate their development and emerge as smaller toadlets before they're left high and dry. The northern leopard frog depends on ephemeral wetlands for breeding. The northern leopard frog doesn't do well in waters containing non-native bass, non-native sunfish, and the non-native American bullfrog. The ephemeral wetlands are the only place you're going to find fairy shrimp that are living and breeding. So these are the puddles you see this time of year, and you go, you know, I wish that farmer would go out and drain that puddle. Well, that puddle is probably full of all the life that we're looking at here and shouldn't be drained. You're likely to find clam shrimp in ephemeral wetlands or vernal pools. This is a crustacean. Look at all the ducks in this photo. Ephemeral wetlands are of monumental importance to waterfowl. Why? They contain an abundance of invertebrates and annual plant seeds ducks use for food. The key to helping migrating waterfowl is to provide them with ephemeral wetlands that they may use for food. Now, I've worked as a wildlife biologist for 42 years, and I don't understand how other biologists build wetlands that contain deep water and fish and say they're doing it to produce ducks. It doesn't work that way. We need shallow water wetlands that are ephemeral and contain this diversity of invertebrates and aquatic plants and their seeds. These are the food factories for ducks, whether they're here breeding or whether or not they're migrating through the area. Now, communities are building wetlands across BC to clean water from storms. We're finding that wetlands will naturally clean the runoff. The BC Wildlife Federation has worked with the Nature Conservancy of Canada to build a series of wetlands near Duncan, and these are removing sediment before it enters Quanchin Lake. Why do we want to clean sediment out of the water? Well, sediment is the primary source of phosphorus and nitrogen to lakes that causes these algae blooms. If we can control that sediment, we can prevent the nasty algae. It's a beautiful wetland at Logan Lake. The BC Wildlife Federation is working with the BC Institute of Technology, BCIT, and the community of Logan Lake and others. And we're building wetlands that clean runoff from an old salt storage shed and from a golf course before it can enter Logan Lake. And BCIT instructs a week-long field course each year where students learn about wetlands and are involved in the restoration of wetlands. See this wetland here? Looks like it's starting to dry, which is okay. The BC Wildlife Federation helped the Salt Spring Island Conservancy to design and build wetlands on Salt Spring Island. And these wetlands were built to clean runoff before it entered Blackburn Lake. What's nice about these wetlands is that they're providing breeding habitat for the northern red-legged frog, a species at risk. The next time you're in Selmo, please look for KP Park. The BC Wildlife Federation worked with the city of Selmo to build a wetland at the entrance of at KP Park, and this wetland cleans stormwater runoff. We built the wetland using heavy equipment. Here you see an excavator and a dump truck, and these machines are removing the large quantity of soil that had been used to fill that wetland years ago. Here the excavator is shaping a basin for the wetland and placing large branches and logs in around the edge to provide habitat for wildlife. Now I want you to look at the little puddle of water in this wetland. When you build a wetland to clean stormwater runoff or to attenuate flooding, you don't want a lot of water in that wetland. It needs reserve so that when you have a storm event, it can gain all that water, hold it, and clean it. And this is how you want the wetlands to appear when you're building them for stormwater. Now, this stormwater wetland we built at KP Park, we built it as part of the 2012 BC Wildlife Federation Wetlands Institute. Wetland Institute's participants helped with the design and construction of this wetland at KP Park. And we planted native species of shrubs. Here's a dogwood being planted around the new wetland. It's very much a hands-on course in wetland design and wetland restoration, the BC Wetlands Institute. If you attend, you'll learn how to control erosion, you'll learn how to clean runoff, and you'll learn about establishing native plants around these restored habitats. And you may be able to participate in a Design Star competition. And as part of the Design Star competition, we build houses for the Western toad. And you're looking at the first place winner here. Beautiful toad house. Okay, here's the new wetland at KP Park the day it was finished. I know it's not a beautiful thing. Let's come back and look at it a few years later. Okay, here it is 2 years later. Looks natural, great habitat, and it cleans runoff from the city. This is the same wetland at KP Park. And what we're finding is these wetlands can be beautiful additions to a community and that they will increase property values. So what we have seen is that if you have a home with a view of a lake, it's going to be worth a lot of money. If you have a home and it has a view of a wetland, it's going to be worth a whole lot more money than if it has a view of your neighbor's backyard. Why? We see all these wildlife species, wetlands. Now here's a nice interpretive sign that they placed near the wetland at KP Park, and it explains how the wetland cleans runoff from the city of Selmo. Here's a new project that Robin Anschild just finished with the BC Wildlife Federation. And this was a reservoir that had been used by Creston. It's now abandoned, and it had this high dam around it. And Robin worked with the town of Creston, and they transformed it into a fishing pond. As part of the project, they also restored a number of wetland areas from another reservoir area that was no longer needed. And they're going to turn this area into a park, and people are going to be able to see these natural habitats and to see a lot of wildlife, and they won't have to maintain the dams anymore, and it's going to be quite an attraction. We're building wetlands for science education. The BC Wildlife Federation is building wetlands at schools, and this is a wetland that the BC Wildlife Federation built in 2009 at Cayush Elementary School in Lillooet. Here's one of 3 wetlands the BC Wildlife Federation helped to restore at Erickson Elementary School near Creston, BC in 2018. Here's how the wetlands appeared last year at Erickson Elementary School. And as part of this project at Erickson Elementary School, the BC Wildlife Federation also took a ditch and restored a stream. Beautiful habitat. Now, if you explore a wetland with students, you're going to have their full attention. For real adventure, ask them to put on rubber boots or a pair of waders. Grab a net, and you're going to open up a world of investigation to them. Sure, they're going to have fun catching tadpoles and dragonfly larvae, but they're going to learn a lot about ecosystems, and they're going to learn that science is really cool and that STEM education is something that you want to do. Now, I took this photo of 2 high school students. They're completing a worksheet at a wetland. Now, the man on the left, he stopped me last year, and we're talking. He said, "Tom, do you remember me?" I said, "No, I don't remember you." And he said, "Well, you took us on a field trip to a wetland." And he proceeded to tell me everything that we did on that field trip 20 years after the field trip. So this shows how wetlands can serve as outdoor classrooms for this experiential hands-on learning that students are going to remember all their lives. So when the BC Wildlife Federation involves students in a wetland project, they're involved in every step. They learn the importance of wetlands. They learn about native species of plants and the control of non-native species of plants. In the very near future, the BC Wildlife Federation is going to be restoring a wetland in Mackenzie Secondary School in Mackenzie, BC. Now, the students can add leaves to the new wetland. They have fun doing this, but the leaves they learn will help feed the invertebrates that will be living in the water, which in turn will be eaten by the salamanders, which in turn will control the mosquitoes. Here's a new wetland that the BC Wildlife Federation built at Ecole Mount Provost Elementary School in Duncan, BC. The BC helped build this wetland at Scalep School of Excellence in Kamloops, BC. The students planted the wetland with culturally important plants. The BC Wildlife Federation was a partner in this project, building a series of wetlands at North Jubal, located right next door to Roslyn Secondary School in Roslyn, BC. The wetlands at North Jubilee Park, they're used by students and all the people that live around them in the community. And oh, do they see wildlife and a diversity of pollinators using these wetlands. The volunteers are very active in Roslyn, and they've planted this amazing diversity of plants in and around these restored wetlands. The wetlands will fill with stormwater, will clean the stormwater, and really they're saving a lot in mowing costs. I visit so many communities where they mow all these areas, and you try to figure out, why are they mowing them? Do they look that nice? Not really. It's costing the city a lot of money to mow areas. It's using a lot of fossil fuels. Why not restore wetlands? It gives folks something completely different to explore. The BC Wildlife Federation has a program that's helping farmers and wildlife. Yes, we put the two together. We're restoring wetlands from fields that are too wet to farm. What does the program do? It works by building a wetland in approximately 1/2 of the field that's too wet to farm, and spreading the soil removed from digging the wetland on the other half to raise the elevation so it can be farmed. And these areas that are too wet to farm are dominated by reed canary grass. Here's an excavator, and it's digging the wetland, and the dozer is spreading the soil on the adjacent ground that's dominated by reed canary grass to raise the elevation so it can be farmed. The work can be done in the winter when the ground is frozen. And here we are spreading the soil removed from building the wetland. The improved field is in the foreground, and the restored wetland is in the background. And that restored wetland is covered with snow. And if you look closely, you see a full beaver lodge that we built in the restored wetland. And here's how one of the improved fields looks 1 year after construction. You can see the wetland in the background. The new wetland is in the foreground and the improved field is in the background. The BC Wildlife Federation helped Brenda and John to restore wetlands and improve their land for farming near Kelowna, BC. Here's a 1 hectare size wetland the BC Wildlife Federation restored on Manon Van Tool's farm at Meadow Creek, BC. The soil that was removed from restoring the wetland was used to improve a field over 1 hectare in size, and the elevation of that field was raised almost 1.5 meters. I'd like to introduce you to Brandon Parsons and Callie Olick. They are the owners of Salix and Sedge Farm near Salmo, BC. Brandon and Callie own land that was too wet to farm and too expensive to drain. They farmed for a living and they also liked helping wildlife. So the BCWF worked with Brandon and Callie to design a wetland restoration project to work to gain the necessary approvals and to work to obtain the funding so that we could restore the wetlands and improve their land for farming. And here's one of the newly restored wetlands on their farm. It now provides great habitat for diversity of wildlife with its pits and its mounds and its large woody debris. Here's one of their new fields. The elevation was raised over 1 meter. Everyone was pleased with the results. Really, it's a win-win. Get rid of reed canary grass, restore wetlands, improve farmland. Now, Callie and Brandon have since built a greenhouse on one of their improved fields, and that's really helping their farming operations. The BC Wildlife Federation is working with ranchers to provide water for wildlife and for livestock. You're looking at a new wetland that was built with a livestock watering ramp near Barnhart Vale, BC. And this ramp provides livestock with access to clean water, and it helps to protect the wildlife using the rest of the wetland. The wetland you're looking at here was built to provide breeding habitat for the Great Basin spadefoot. This is a species at risk in BC. And the wetland was built near Barnhart Vale. The wetland, we fenced it and we built a ramp so that cows can have access to clean water to drink and wildlife have a refuge where they won't get trampled. And it was fascinating. Look at this ramp. You don't see any cow pies on it. The cows would come in quickly, take a drink, and then leave. And they wouldn't rest in the water and contaminate the water, which isn't good for cows or wildlife. Okay, this is a wetland that historically held water all year, but it went dry and had been dry for many, many years. So participants in the 2010 BC Wetlands Institute helped restore this wetland so it contained water all year. The perimeter of the restored wetland has now been fenced and a ramp has been added to provide livestock with access to clean water. And this has held water ever since, and people have never seen it so full of water. This wetland had also been dry for many years. The BC Wildlife Federation rebuilt it in 2016, and it now contains water year-round. Here's another dry basin that the BC Wildlife Federation rebuilt, and it now contains water year-round for livestock and for wildlife. Again, the fence was put up, the ramp was put in to provide cows with clean access to clean water. Many of the wetlands the BC Wildlife Federation is helping to restore, they're designed specifically for wildlife. Communities are finding that tourists are going to travel great distances to see and hear wildlife in BC. And I can tell you that BC is the most beautiful place on earth. And if you can see wildlife, it just really adds to the experience. We're building wetlands that attract and feed waterfowl. These wetlands contain shallow water and they provide ducks and geese with an abundance of food and nesting habitat. The photo that you see here shows ducks using a newly built wetland near Meadow Creek, BC. Now, I'd like you to take a moment and see if you can count the number of ducks that are on the water and on the logs. This wetland is very shallow. The average depth is 20 to 30 centimeters. The wetland is very new. It's 1 year old. Look at all the ducks there. Beautiful drone photograph. I counted 86. That's a lot of ducks using a new wetland. Tanbo means dragonfly in Japanese. These wetlands were built for wildlife on the Tullaberry Farm near Salmo, BC. Wetlands don't have to be large to help animals. This is a small wetland on the Tullaberry Farm, and it's being used by ducks, frogs, and toads. So when I first started building wetlands in 1979, everybody said they need to be 40 acres or larger in size. They were wrong. So many of the wildlife species that are present in BC have adapted to living in small wetlands. And you can build a wetland only a couple meters in diameter and benefit many species. This is a shallow marsh wetland on the Tullaberry Farm. It's been colonized by native sedges within just a couple of years after being built. Beautiful wetland, isn't it? The BC Wildlife Federation worked in partnership with the Regional District of Central Kootenay to transform this no longer used water reservoir into a naturally appearing and functioning wetland for species at risk. And this is located near the community of Lister Creek. It was a rectangle-shaped reservoir with steep banks, and we transformed it into a shallow marsh wetland with gradual slopes and a natural shape. We added shallow water bays, peninsulas, and large woody debris to the reservoir, changing it into a natural appearing wetland. We also removed a dam that was eroding and ready to fail, and we restored the section of stream for aquatic organism passage. But yet we wanted to provide access for wildlife and for people who wanted a challenge. So we placed this log over the section of restored stream, and it's a great attraction. We purposely placed logs in restored wetlands to provide waterfowl with places to loaf. We purposely placed logs in wetlands to provide the western painted turtle with a place to bask. And the logs are used by great blue herons for perching while they're hunting. We also place boulders in the wetlands that we restore, provide basking sites for turtles and sunning sites for snakes. See the snags that are in this restored wetland? We place those purposely to help wildlife. A bald eagle will perch on snags in your wetland areas. This is a great way to make wildlife visible to visitors. If you place a snag near the edge of a restored wetland, you're going to find many birds perching on these snags. Here are some of the many bird species that will use snags near wetland areas. The great blue heron and the bald eagle will build their nests near the tops of the snags that are near wetland areas. There are many species of bats that roost in snags near wetland areas. Okay, time for a quiz. We're going to see if you can tell the difference between a natural wetland and a constructed wetland. So please look at this wetland on your screen. What do you think? Is a wetland natural or is it built by humans? Let's find out. Okay, this wetland was built in 2012 and it cost around $1,900 Canadian. How about this wetland right here? Natural or constructed? What do you think? Looks natural to me. Oops, it's constructed. It was restored by the Salt Spring Island Conservancy in 2006. It had been dominated by reed canary grass, and it now supports a diversity of native plant species. How about this wetland? Looks pretty natural. We built this in 1 day using an excavator. The next wetland here, this was built by Ducks Unlimited Canada near 100 Mile House. And what's interesting about that wetland is that the community built their visitor center right on the shores. Quite an attraction. How about this wetland? We built this wetland in one day for a workshop, and it was built using an aquatic safe liner. And this wetland, the BC Wildlife Federation helped to build this wetland on the Tulleyberry Farm near Selmo in 2013. Now, there are wetlands that are attractive and there are wetlands that are ugly. This is certainly one of these ugly wetlands. Constructed or natural? Well, it's a natural wetland. It's an elk wallow. Provides habitat to a diversity of frogs and crustaceans. How about this wetland? It's a beautiful wetland. It's a shallow marsh, and it was restored by the Salt Spring Island Conservancy in 2016 from a golf course. This wetland here, beautiful diversity of plants. Yes, it's natural. How about this wetland? Is it constructed? Yeah, it's constructed, but it was constructed by a beaver. See the beaver dam on the right? How about this wetland here? This is a fairly unique wetland. This is a bog or a peatland, but it's really constructed. It's really natural. It formed on an old logging road near Nelson, BC. And here's a wetland area. And this was restored on the Earl Ranch near Newgate, BC. So we humans often show great concern if a wetland is natural or constructed. However, this doesn't appear to be a concern to the animals and plants as long as they can find habitat to live, as long as they can find places to hide from predators, places to feed. So there's a great need to restore wetlands for wildlife and for plants. It's now possible to restore wetlands that appear and function like natural wetlands and that don't require maintenance. The wetlands we're building are soon colonized by native plants. This wetland was only 1 year old when the photo was taken. The wapato, a culturally important plant to First Nations, will grow naturally in many of these wetlands that we're restoring. And this one was taken near Creston, BC. So in summary, can you build a wetland? Yes, you can. I'm showing you a photo here of folks that are building wetlands near Quamachin Lake in Duncan to clean runoff before it enters Quamachin Lake. And here's a photo showing some of the wetlands that they've built. Here's a photo of Terry Halloran, and he pioneered wetland restoration near Meadow Creek, BC. And he often sends photographs to me of some of the wetlands that have been built. And it's interesting, his neighbor, Terry Halloran's neighbor, Audrey Matthews, decided she would like to have wetlands on her farm. And then Terry's other neighbor, Manon Van Tool, also wanted wetlands on her property. So she joined the club of wetland builders. Here's Jerry Nelliston. He's built a number of wetlands on his land near Selmo. And here's Alex and Judy Berland. They've built wetlands on their Tulleyberry farm near Selmo. You know, none of these people are engineers or have PhDs in wetland ecology, but they all have this love of the environment and they want to help fish and wildlife. So Heather Tolles, who works at Shoppers Drug Mart, and Milt Stanley on the left, who's a retired math teacher, they have volunteered to build wetlands for over 10 years in the Kamloops area. And here's Milt doing a happy dance in a wetland that we built near Barnhartvale. The wetlands they're building are used by a variety and quite a diversity of plants and animals. Here's Elka Wind. She's a professional herpetologist. She's designing and building wetlands to provide breeding habitat for rare species of amphibians. I think you'll agree that the wetlands she's building look great. Here's Summer Lipens. She's standing next to one of the new wetlands she built near Barnhartvale. And she's building wetlands to help the Great Basin spadefoot, a species at risk. Sarma is so dedicated, she built a wetland in her backyard. Perniva Garvindaw Julu took the lead in building this wetland at the Halliburton farm near Vancouver Island. and it's been used by the Pacific tree frog and other species. Here's Brian Turturro. He has worked with hundreds of volunteers to restore a bog wetland near Stanley Park. What a beautiful environment here. The volunteers have spent days on their hands and knees removing non-native plants from the bog. Edith Tobe restores wetlands in the estuary near Squamish, and she's designed and implemented major projects to restore these wetlands and streams. Greg Lamont has done the same thing. He's been restoring all sorts of wetlands in the Kootenays. All right, if you're interested in wetland design and possibility of restoring and protecting wetlands, the BC Wildlife Federation can assist you. They'll help you identify areas where wetlands may be restored, like this wetland that was drained with ditches. The BC Wildlife Federation will help you identify drainage features and what actions need to be taken to disable them. They'll take elevations and they'll work with you to design a natural appearing and functioning wetland on your land. And they can even help you find the funding for these projects. The Fish and Wildlife Compensation Program and the Columbia Basin Trust are major funders of wetland restoration projects in the Columbia Basin region. If you're interested in learning about wetlands and more about their construction and design, I encourage you to attend the BC Wildlife Federation Wetlands Institute. This year it's being held in the Comox Valley and on Gallinino Island. Begins Saturday, October 2nd, runs until Friday, October 8th. There's no charge for the training, but participants are asked to pay for their own travel, meals, and lodging. So yes, you can learn to build wetlands. If you're interested in learning more about wetlands and their values and how to restore them, I encourage you to read these books that I've written. So in summary, wetlands are amazing ecosystems. They have so many values to our communities. They naturally clean water and they recharge groundwater. Wetlands provide unparalleled opportunities to view wildlife. Wetlands can provide habitat for rare species of birds. And wetlands can provide habitat for rare species of mammals like the grizzly bear. So I encourage you to help protect wetlands in your community. And I also encourage you to consider restoring wetlands that have been drained. Please contact myself and or the BC Wildlife Federation if you have any questions about wetlands. Thank you for your participating in this webinar, and we're going to move on to our next phase.
Wow, Tom, thank you so much. I loved your comment about so much. Even the comment about the mosquitoes, and then I was like, yeah, but what eats them? And next thing I know, all these different animals that are involved in eating them. We don't have any questions on. I know that I have quite a few questions. We've done a lot of work recently learning about climate change, so I'm keen to find out your thoughts on the impacts of climate change. On how that might be affecting wetlands, if some types of wetlands may be impacted more than others. I don't know.
We're finding that wetlands are really important carbon sinks. When you think about it, if a plant dies in a wetland, that carbon is sequestered in the sediments forever. And also the plants produce so much oxygen in the wetlands, and they're so important to pollinators. So yes, wetlands are of great value in trying to combat the effects of climate change. And they also recharge groundwater, which is such importance.
Have you found that some types of wetlands are being more impacted, like the marshes or bogs, or is
yes,
it pretty much areas? Or
what
the
I'm finding,
ephemeral, which I loved your comments on the ephemeral wetlands. I'll let you talk now.
The shallow marshes are the ones that appear to be the least impacted because people recognize them as wetlands, but swamps are heavily impacted. Ephemeral wetlands are, wet meadows are greatly impacted. So yes, unfortunately, I'm still seeing quite a few impacts to wetlands across BC.
Well, I have a couple of other questions, but I'm going to go right to our Q&A. We just had 3 questions that came in. Where do you access seed stock in BC for wetland vegetation, or are you collecting native seeds in the field and doing transplants?
Okay, there are a number of sources for native aquatic plants across BC, and I just do a search on the internet, under native aquatic plants. And also to answer the question, yes, we collect many of these native plant seeds right from the local area. And oftentimes we go into drainage ditches and we can find native aquatic plants. And if you're out there in late summer, early fall, you can collect quite a few of these seeds and save yourself some money.
Wow. We've got a question here from Vicky. She said, I think I heard that you're working or going to be working in the Grand Forks area. Do you need an do we need an assessment to determine where best to build them wetlands to reduce flooding?
Oh, there is so much potential in the Grand Forks area. Perhaps the best assessment that can be done is to look at what areas flooded.
Mhm.
The areas that flooded are the areas where the work could be done to restore wetlands, and where homes have been removed. Those are suitable places for restoring wetlands, for flood attenuation, and for people to enjoy and to see wildlife. So yes, there are many opportunities for this in Grand Forks.
So one of the things that I noticed in this area is we've got a fairly big change in groundwater level between the different years, or different seasons. Is that something, is that just more looking at different conditions for which might be a better wetland area, or working within a big change in groundwater depth is?
What we're seeing in many communities is that there's so much groundwater being removed, whether it's for urban use or for industrial use or for ranching. And in some areas, this is having a significant impact on the elevation of groundwater. So we're seeing that in the states, where areas where wetlands used to be full, now they're dry, and that groundwater, that elevation has dropped many meters. And it is directly related to how much water is being pulled out of the earth. But wetlands that we build will recharge the aquifer. They will inject that water into the ground. I mean, there's a clear relationship. If you have wetland basins and you have that snow melt, you're injecting it into the ground and replenishing that water table.
Oh, wow. A quick question here from Alan, and then what I'll actually do is go into one of my other slides here. Curious about the use of liners to maintain wetland water levels. Can you speak more to this?
Okay, so I was working in Rhode Island this past week, and we have a rare species, a state endangered species called the eastern spadefoot, and it depends on wetlands for breeding that only hold water for 30 days or less. And these are the most ephemeral of wetlands. And it depends on sandy soils for burrowing the rest of its life cycle. So we looked for places to build wetlands on Rhode Island, and we found out that where the groundwater was high, there were already wetlands, and they held water all year. They wouldn't be used by the eastern spadefoot. And there was no clay, and there was no source of clay. So we were able to use aquatic safe liners, and we were able to bury them under about 20 centimeters of soil. And we have now naturally appearing ephemeral wetlands that are so shallow. These wetlands are only like 10 centimeters deep, and they should hold water after a rainstorm. So a liner gives you an opportunity to build a wetland where you don't have groundwater and you don't have clay. So when building at a school, most of the time we use liners because we're building over drainage systems and we're building on construction fill. So it's another way to build a wetland where you don't have suitable soils.
Thank you. I'm just going to really quickly take 2 minutes here. One of the things that I wanted to also speak to for supporting the boundary side of it is just helping us better understand, where are our wetlands within the boundary region. You are able to find a mapping of the wetland area through IMAP. So I sort of put down the bottom here, the link to IMAP. All of our BC government folks are going to definitely know IMAP. Really, you can just Google IMAP BC government and coming into this. It does require a little bit of spatial and GIS knowledge. But what this is showing me is where the BC government has mapped out or identified wetlands within the boundary region. So this is the boundary in which I've got an outline of the Kettle River watershed. It'd be interesting, as I'm sort of putting it out to the boundary folks here, if you do see a wetland, if you are able to go to that IMAP, is that wetland that you see, has it been mapped? We're really trying to make sure that we've got a really good understanding of what we've got out there right now. I know that Tom has spoken a lot about building new wetlands, but also really protecting what we have. So you should have seen thinking that, okay, well, maybe I can't really get it, this tiny little dot on the big picture. So this is me zooming in. So you can see that Conkle Lake, so that southeast area of Area E, you know, we can see all the orange here, all the little wetlands that have been identified. People are going to know that Boundary Creek area north of Greenwood has the wetlands there. So really, if you are out in the bush, out in the boundary, see a wetland, take the coordinates, or if you are able to go and do some mapping of it, to figure out, you know, has it been shown, and do we have that proper representation of that wetland there? So on that note, I am going to go back and finish answering some of these, or asking Tom some of these questions from the Q&A box. Thank you. So Christine Tom has asked, is there a difference between cattails and bulrushes, and how can I control these in my pond?
Yes, there is a difference. Cattails are much wider, the leaves, and their flowers completely different than bulrushes. And yes, they will grow quite thick, and they can crowd out all open water. As far as controlling them, the most natural way of doing it is to find some healthy muskrats and invite them to come in. And the muskrats will feed on the cattails and build their houses out of them. That's not always possible. People will pull them by hand, which is quite a job. I've pulled many cattails by hand to create small open patches of water. We've also cut them below the water level. But one of the most effective ways of controlling cattails is to dry the wetland. And if the wetland dries, then a person can go out there with maybe a string trimmer, or, you know, if the ground really bakes, that will shock the cattails. But I'm not aware of any chemicals that are labeled for use in BC for controlling cattails. So pretty much left up with the hand versions, and muskrats are our friends. I mean, they will really control them. I've seen many wetlands that are completely choked by cattails. Muskrats move in within a couple of years. You can barely find a cattail. But cattails have many values. I mean, that's where the dragonflies will emerge from. That's where the birds will nest. But we like to see some open water, I know. I understand the concern.
Thank you. Catherine asked, do you find ephemeral wetlands more challenging for restoration as there may be less water available?
Actually, the science behind building ephemeral wetlands, it's pretty easy. You want the water to soak into the ground, or you want it to evaporate. So you're building shallow depressions. The social part is the difficult. I've worked with people across BC who say that they want ephemeral wetlands, and for specific purposes, especially amphibian management, we build the ephemeral wetlands, and then they're concerned that the wetland goes dry come June or July. And they say, well, the wetland doesn't hold water all year. Well, it's not supposed to. So socially, I think the ephemeral wetland is a tough one for people to accept, because for half the year, it doesn't look like much. So what I find with most private landowners, the first couple of wetlands we build are the marshes, and then they see that they don't have as much wildlife use. So we get into ephemeral wetlands, and then they have this deafening chorus of frogs, and they go, yes, we should have done this earlier on. Good question.
I thought, yeah, I learned a lot about just that importance of the ephemeral wetland. It's definitely not one that I think people identify as much with, for sure. Vicky asked, what kind of authorizations, so this would be BC, are needed to develop a wetland?
Oh, you'll need to go through Front Counter BC is what you'll need to do. And there are a number of steps. Number of steps, anytime you're working near a stream or any other body of water, yes. And plan ahead. It can take at least a year to get approval for these projects. So yes, there are some steps to take. Now, Christina, I wanted to ask you about mapping. When somebody finds a wetland, do you want them to take a GPS point, or do you want them to walk around it and get you a shape file? What's going to help you?
Well, thank you very much, Tom. Yes, of course, I tried to speed through that just to get to the questions to you. You know what, it would be really what people are comfortable doing. And the other one would be if somebody was comfortable going into IMAP and seeing if it is mapped. You know, for some people, they're very comfortable using those different mapping systems and being able to say, you know what, I looked in IMAP, I have this wetland here, and it's not showing up in the layer that the BC government has on the system. If somebody else says, you know what, that's not my forte, a coordinate of it, or yeah, certainly a shape file if that's available to them.
Okay.
So I think the biggest one that we've got a lot of conversations that have been happening lately, and the comment of the lack of wetlands within this region is coming up rather regularly. So it's really trying to understand how much, is it true? Do we really lack that many wetlands in our region, and really what's the importance of the wetland specifically for
yes. I would recommend that they send you photos too, then you can help identify what type of wetland it is.
Yes, I may have to call you.
But I know that ephemeral wetlands, there's been very little mapping done of these.
We just lost your sound for some reason. So, oh, there we go. You've muted yourself, and I will, as we try to work on that, I'm just going to quickly speak a comment here from Graham Watt. Speaks to the city of Grand Forks will be undertaking a major wetland restoration, floodplain and restoration in 2 neighborhoods near the Kettle and Granby rivers, planning ahead for a participatory design charrette in September 2021 and installation in 2022. Hope to involve BCWF during design and installation. So that's fantastic.
Fantastic.
That's great news to know that this is going to be happening.
Okay, that's really good. Okay, I wanted to comment about do we need more wetlands? Now, I give a presentation on wetland drainage, and it will open your eyes how many wetlands have been lost to drainage in BC. It is unbelievable. And for the comment, we already have enough wetlands. Oh, come on now. That's like saying you have too much money. That's like saying you have a partner who's too good at looking. That's like saying that you have a vehicle that gets, so many kilometers, per gallon or per liter. There's no such thing. So many wetlands have been lost in the valleys across BC that we can spend the rest of our lives restoring them and not make up for this loss. So yes, there's a need for it. And people like looking at them. They are attractive, as you can see. And they can be built not to require maintenance.
Really?
Oh, yes.
True. You've spoken to me about that once they're built, that people can generally walk away from them. And
well, see, if you don't build a dam, and if you do not put in a water control structure, and if you do not put in a diversion like a ditch, then that wetland's going to be there forever. We've looked at natural wetlands that are over 10,000 years old, and we can physically change the land so that wetland will be around for thousands of years. So yes, that's another presentation right there. How to build a wetland that will last forever.
Oh my, I think there's so much talk about that, the natural asset component, the stormwater and the water filtration.
Right.
It's a big one. I've got Cheyenne here asks, once these wetlands are created, what work, oh, there we go. Sorry, Cheyenne, we just spoke about this and I hadn't read your question yet. Once these wetlands are created, what work, if any, is put towards maintaining these wetlands? For instance, continued invasive species removal. So that actually was a great one. I wanted to speak to you a little bit about that invasive species component. Are you seeing that more? What is encouraging that invasive species establishment? And how do we,
it's all about setting your priorities. And if your top priority is the control of non-native invasive plants, then we're looking at a lot of work when you build a wetland, because the non-native invasives are going to come in to that disturbed ground. And if you're on top of it and you're out there on a regular basis, you can control them. But what we see is that that value of that shallow water, those saturated soils and the native plants is so great. But this is it's a package deal. When you disturb the ground, being ready to control the non-native invasive plants, it is quite a bit of work. But if you don't have the time or the funding, well, then it's probably best not to build a wetland, because you'll have to get out there and take care of the non-native plants. There's no magic formula.
We are at 11:30, so I'm just going to, I just wanted to bring that up and thank everybody for joining us. We've got a couple more questions, and I know that there's somebody that's written a comment in the chat box, which I'll touch to right afterwards. But more than anything, I just wanted to quickly say thank you, Tom, so much for attending and participating in this webinar with us. It's like I said, it's a huge conversation that I keep hearing about, and and you've excited me to do more. It's I love that comments on your ephemeral wetlands and the different types of wetlands and how to identify them and why, and the mosquito component of it, because that is definitely one that I've heard. Yeah. So on that note, I'm gonna, if you're okay hanging on, Tom, for another couple.
Oh yes.
I'll sort of the rest of these questions, but for those of you that have had to sign off, thank you very much for participating, and I really appreciate your questions and the input. So we're going to go back to the questions. We've got Vicky, who are there any jurisdictions that offer incentives for people who develop wetlands? So property tax breaks. I don't know whether that's going to be outside of your area.
That's a really good question. I'm not aware of any.
Okay.
That's an area where there are programs out there. There are organizations like the Fish and Wildlife Compensation Program, Columbia Basin Trust. There are programs that will help finance the restoration of wetlands. However, the incentives part, no, I'm not aware of anything like that. The people that get involved in the wetland restoration work and protection work, they do it out of their strong dedication and interest, and I'm not aware of any funding though for that.
And it's an interesting question, and if people are aware of it or see sort of somebody starting a regional district or a municipality starting some of those opportunities, it would certainly be something that I'd be interested in hearing about. So if anybody does hear about it, please watershedplanner@rdkb.com. I certainly would be interested in hearing about what people are doing out there. Taylor asks, are you aware of anyone in BC funding wetland construction through carbon credits? That's one that we're hearing a lot about right now.
No, I'm not aware of that. No.
Yeah.
Nope, for carbon credits.
Haven't heard, but I think that's certainly something to keep your ears open for, because I know that that's been a big conversation, how to get those carbon credits. Alyssa, there are many farms in northern BC that have wetlands being drained by old drainage ditches, and you certainly spoke a lot about that. But some of those areas are now seeing flooding. If a farmer was interested, could they contact BC Wildlife Federation to help restore their wetland?
Well, yes, that would be great. Yes, that's what we're finding, is that most of these farm fields were built by draining wetlands, and that drainage system requires expensive maintenance because ditches fill in and buried drainage structures will become plugged. Some will. So yes, it's expensive. Then also, oftentimes one's not able to get the approval to maintain the drainage system. So that's where the restoration comes in. And, if somebody has a 20-acre field, yes, it'd be great if they could farm all 20 acres, but if they end up with 10 acres of wetland and 10 acres of field, it's better than, I guess, no field. I think it is.
Wow, and maybe keeping the mosquitoes down.
There you go.
And Suzanne asks, how often do you use transplanted wetland material or constructed wetlands? Does this help with keeping weeds out? Are native wetlands plants competitive?
Oh, it's great. I mean, if we're working to disable a drainage ditch, then what we'll do is we'll use heavy equipment and we'll remove the native plants from that drainage ditch, set them aside, and then replant them as soon as the wetland's completed. So yes, anytime you can remove what I call native sod and then put it back, yes, it really helps.
Really appreciated your comments on the reed canary grass. That's a big one for this region. And I've been hearing that we had that in a previous riparian presentation or webinar, and just speaking about how do we manage it? How do we try to get that vegetation involved with reed canary grass?
The reed canary grass is a strong indicator of a drained wetland. So when you see reed canary grass, I will guarantee that you're looking at a drained wetland, because these people years ago who dug the ditches and put in the drainage structures, then they farmed the land for so many years, they're no longer farming it. And that's when the reed canary grass came in. So whenever you see reed canary grass, if you look, you will find ditches, and you're looking at a drained wetland. So if you reshape that basin and disable the ditches, the reed canary grass won't like it, and you won't see nearly as much of it.
Isn't that interesting?
But we're thinking that reed canary grass is native to BC,
Okay.
but there's a number of varieties, and they were worked on by farmers, because if they had damp ground, they could sow reed canary grass, and then that would grow. But reed canary grass is a very poor forage for horses and cows. I've talked to enough ranchers who say that this reed canary grass is poor to feed my animals. They don't get much of anything out of it. And it's really tough to harvest, because you're likely to get your tractor stuck when you try to cut it. So that's why you might as well restore a wetland out of it.
Oh, isn't that
So
interesting?
just like a ditch is a sign of a drained wetland, reed canary grass is a sign of a drained wetland. And we can change that.
You're getting me started. A couple of conversations I already know who I'm going to be talking with. We had one question. I don't know if Foster is still on, but he did say, can you please repeat or share information about the event in October at the Comox Valley Galliano?
Okay, please go to the BC Wildlife Federation website and go to their wetlands program, and you'll have information about the BC Wildlife Federation Wetlands Institute. A week of training, being outside, away from your computer, examining wetlands of all different types, learning how to identify all these wetlands, and then also building wetlands in a beautiful part of BC. Doesn't get any better than that.
Thank you so much, Tom. I really appreciate it. I, of course, have
Thank you
questions
for organizing this. You did a great job.
Well,
Lots of planning goes into this. Thank you for sharing the information and letting people know that wetlands have many values.
Yeah, and we look forward to having you back in this region. And
I look forward to returning.
Good.
Thank you.
Okay, on that, thank you
everybody.
I appreciate you taking the time, and we hopefully have fun exploring wetlands.
I'm going to. Thank you.